My father leaned in, his voice a blade of ice in the warm California air. Daughter, serving your country is noble, but it doesn't pay the bills. Best get used to living off your sister's charity. He patted my shoulder and walked away to accept an award on her behalf. He left me standing there, a ghost in my own life, invisible to the family I'd sworn to protect. But they made one fatal mistake. They forgot that ghosts remember everything, and that this soldier was about to start a war of her own. My name is Taryn Wells. I'm 37 years old. The Atherton Institute in Palo Alto shimmered under the late afternoon California sun, a symphony of hushed conversations and the clinking of expensive glassware. I stood alone near a wall of bougainvillea, a ghost in Levi's jeans and a J. Crew shirt, trying to blend into a world I no longer belonged to. A waiter offered a flute of Veuve Clicquot. I politely declined with a shake of my head. "I'm on duty," I murmured, a reflex I couldn't unlearn. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. My duty here was simply to exist, a prop in the grand play of my family's success. Then he approached. My father, Alistair Vance, didn't walk toward me with the warmth of a parent, but with the purposeful stride of a CEO about to deliver a difficult performance review. He stopped beside me, his gaze sweeping out over the perfectly manicured lawns, avoiding my eyes. He leaned in, his voice a blade of ice against my ear, sharp and precise. "Daughter, serving your country is noble, but it doesn't pay the bills. You'd best get used to the idea of living off Alara's charity." He didn't wait for a response. He patted my shoulder, a condescending gesture meant to soothe the child, and then he was gone, moving toward the stage. The words were a precision strike, designed to neutralize my presence. They hung in the air, invisible and toxic. Just as the shock began to crystallize, my mother, Genevieve, drifted past. Her eyes, cold and appraising, flickered down to my simple leather boots, then back up. She leaned toward a woman dripping in diamonds beside her, her voice a stage whisper meant for me to overhear. You'd think she would at least try. The twin humiliations struck in quick succession, private and brutal, which only made them cut deeper. I stood frozen, a statue amidst the vibrant life of the party. My hand shoved deep into the pocket of my jacket, clenched into a fist. I felt each knuckle turn white, the pressure a grounding force against the wave of nausea. I was a phantom, a forgotten soldier on a battlefield of wealth and status, and in my mind a cold, hard thought took root. Ghosts forget nothing. Alistair was on stage now, bathed in the golden light. The microphone amplified his smooth, charismatic voice as he began his tribute to his golden child, my sister, Ilara. "Ilara is the future," he declared, his arm gesturing expansively. "A mind that will shape the next century." He then paused, a master of timing, and his eyes found mine across the crowd. "And while we honor those who choose a path of service, a path of inherent uncertainty," he continued, the veiled reference a public echo of his private stab. "It is innovators like Alara who build the world we all live in." It was then that the sound came, a low, guttural thumping that grew rapidly into a roar, tearing through the polite ambiance of the garden party. It wasn't a commercial helicopter from the nearby airfield. This was the distinctive, powerful beat of a Sikorsky HH-60G Pave Hawk. Heads turned, conversations faltered. The helicopter didn't circle. It executed a tactical approach, its rotor wash a sudden, violent storm. It descended over the far lawn, blasting silk scarves from necks, toppling towers of champagne flutes, and sending a wave of chaos through the elegant crowd. People gasped, ducked, and shouted in alarm. My family on the stage looked on in stunned disbelief, but I was the only one who remained perfectly still. The sound was a part of me. I started walking toward it, my steps measured and calm. The Blackhawk touched down, its side door already open. An officer in a flight suit, a man half my age, jumped to the ground and ran toward me, his movements economical and urgent. He stopped 2 feet in front of me, his back ramrod straight, and snapped a crisp, perfect salute. "Colonel Wells," he announced, his voice cutting through the din, "we need you." The world seemed to freeze. Every eye was on us. I saw my mother's hand fly to her mouth. I saw Ilara's look of confused awe. But the most satisfying sight was my father. Standing on the podium, his face had transformed from smug satisfaction to a mask of utter, slack-jawed disbelief. The power he wielded, the millions he controlled, had just been rendered meaningless by a single uniformed officer and a military-grade helicopter. Another figure emerged from the aircraft. Major Kalen Ryder, my second in command. Kale, my brother in arms. While the young pilot explained to the stunned event organizers that a surprise Medal of Valor ceremony was being authorized, Kale pulled me aside, his expression grim, his voice low and urgent. "This is a strategic move, Terran," he said, his words a cold dose of reality. "Someone has been using your security credentials to funnel Black Ops R&D funds. Your name is on projects you never approved." He handed me a tablet. The screen glowed with an official-looking document, a funding authorization for millions of dollars. And there at the bottom was my digital signature, perfectly rendered, next to the name of a corporation I had never heard of in my life. MeEveryone Aerospace Solutions. That stark, undeniable proof was colder than the ice in my father's voice, more brutal than my mother's disdain. It was a betrayal that went beyond family politics and into the realm of federal crime, treason. I looked from the tablet back to my family, now a frozen tableau of shock and confusion on the stage. Then I looked at Kyle, my real family, and nodded once. I turned and walked toward the waiting helicopter, leaving behind a shattered party, a silenced crowd, and a family that was only just beginning to understand how badly they had underestimated me. The mystery of who had stolen my legacy was a lethal one, and I was on my way to solve it. The flight from California to D.C. was a blur of altitude and adrenaline. The moment we landed, Kale rushed me to a windowless room deep within a secure government building near the Capitol. A SCIF, sensitive compartmented information facility. The air inside was recycled and stale, thick with the smell of burnt coffee and low-grade panic. There was no day or night in here, only the relentless hum of servers and the harsh glare of fluorescent lights on stacks of documents. This was where truths came to be unearthed or buried forever. Kyle and I worked in silence, our movements synchronized by years of shared pressure. We sifted through digital and physical files, our training kicking in, looking for patterns, for anomalies, and we found them. Contracts worth millions, all funding a constellation of tech startups, all linked to my father's Silicon Valley venture fund. And on every single authorization, my digital signature, pristine and damning. A specific document caught my eye. A funding request for advanced satellite positioning technology. My blood ran cold. A memory, sharp and sudden, pierced through the fog of my focus. An email I'd sent home from a forward operating base in Afghanistan, full of pride. I'd told them about a new satellite navigation system my unit was testing, a breakthrough that was saving lives. I had been so proud, so eager for them to share in a small piece of my world. 2 weeks after I hit send, one of Alistair's portfolio companies received a multi-million-dollar R&D contract to research a remarkably similar technology. The coincidences were no longer coincidences. They were coordinates on a map of betrayal, a map that stretched back years. A Christmas phone call from Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. I remembered the crackle on the line, the 3-second delay. I'd been lonely, missing the sterile pine scent of a fake Christmas tree. Alistair had been full of questions about security protocols, approval chains for high-level expenditures. I thought he was just curious. A father trying to understand his daughter's complex world. I thought it was pride. How could I have mistaken interrogation for pride? He wasn't connecting with his daughter. He was gathering intelligence. The door to the SCIF hissed open, and Gideon Stone, one of the Air Force's top cybersecurity analysts, walked in. He held a single sheet of paper like it was radioactive. "Colonel," he said, his voice flat, "I think I found the legal mechanism." He slid the paper across the table. It was a financial proxy designation. Alistair had registered himself as my sole financial agent. The justification was sickeningly brilliant, that as an officer on active classified duty, I was incapable of managing my own affairs. And the primary evidence he had submitted to the court? A copy of the official letter from the Department of Defense, the very letter that spoke of my honor and commitment announcing my deployment. He had taken my honor and forged it into a license to steal. He had turned my service into his shield. I felt the air leave my lungs, a slow, painful vacuum. The room, already claustrophobic, began to close in. My loyalty, my entire life's dedication, had been turned into a weapon aimed directly at me. And I had been the one to load the ammunition, year after year, with every proud email, every trusting phone call. The oath I took as an officer echoed in my mind, to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The domestic enemy, the traitor, wasn't some shadowy operative. He was my father. "There's more," Gideon said, his face grim. He pointed to the first company on the list, the one from the tablet. Meridian Aerospace Solutions. Kyle quickly pulled up the files on his laptop. Meridian was a shell corporation existing only on paper, but it had produced reports, dense, technical-sounding documents that were complete fiction. One of those fabricated reports, we discovered, had been used as justification to defund a legitimate, life-saving R&D project. It was a project to develop enhanced cockpit armor for fighter pilots. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that project. I knew the officer leading it, Major John Riley, a good man, a friend. Kyle's fingers flew across the keyboard. He pulled up a casualty report from 8 months ago. My eyes scanned the text, but my brain refused to process it. Major John Ripper Riley, mission over Syria. His aircraft took ground fire. The report was clinical. Penetrating shrapnel, severe trauma to the lower extremities. He survived, but he would never fly again. He was injured because the advanced armor that could have protected him was never built. The funding had been redirected, laundered through Meridian Aerospace, and funneled into my father's portfolio. The betrayal was no longer just about money. It wasn't about my stolen signature or my wounded pride. It had a cost paid in blood and bone. My father's greed hadn't just targeted me. It had reached across the globe and crippled one of my own. The quiet, personal anger inside me fractured, then reformed into something harder, colder. This was no longer a family drama. This was an assault on the uniform, an attack on the sacred trust between soldiers. This was a debt of blood, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that it would have to be repaid. The revelation that my father's greed had crippled a fellow soldier left Cale and me in a state of cold fury. In the sterile confines of the Sekok-F, we reached a grim conclusion. We were soldiers, trained for physical and ideological battlefields. This was a different kind of war, one fought with motions, subpoenas, and legal precedent. We were out of our depth. "We need a weapon," I said to Kyle, my voice low. "Not a missile, a lawyer." Kyle knew exactly who to call. The next day, I found myself in a minimalist office in the heart of Washington, D.C. The space was all steel glass and stark white walls, but every object projected power. This was the domain of Seraphina Croft, known in the circles that mattered as the corporate destroyer. She was a sharp, striking woman with a mane of fiery red hair, and she didn't waste a single second. She didn't offer coffee or condolences. She got straight to business. Kyle laid out the core evidence on her expansive glass desk. Seraphina scanned the documents, her eyes moving with terrifying speed and precision. She picked up a printout of the contract from Meridian Aerospace, the one with my forged signature. She barely glanced at the astronomical sum of money. Instead, she stared intently at the signature itself. "This is too perfect," she said, her voice a low purr that held the promise of violence. She tapped the paper. "A real human signature, even a practiced one, has micro-tremors, imperfections. This signature is flawless. It's algorithmic. A machine forged this, not a person." She then looked up, and for the first time her eyes met mine. They held no pity. There was no trace of the sympathetic sadness I was used to. Instead, I saw a flash of something else, recognition. The look of one warrior acknowledging another across a battlefield. "Colonel," she said, her tone level and direct, "your father is a high-stakes gambler, but he's an amateur in a professional's game. He made mistakes, and for those mistakes," she leaned forward, a predatory gleam in her eyes, "I'm going to skin him alive." For the first time since that helicopter landed, a sliver of hope cut through my rage. I had found my weapon. The meeting was intense, draining. Afterwards, I needed air. I left Cale to coordinate with Seraphina's team and just started walking, letting the DC streets guide me. My feet, acting on some instinct I didn't know I possessed, led me to a small, unassuming coffee shop, tucked away on a quiet side street. The sign above the door was simple, carved into a piece of wood. The LZ, the landing zone. I pushed the door open and was met with the warm, comforting scent of dark roast coffee and old wood. The walls were covered in faded photographs of military units, unit patches, and challenge coins pressed into the bar. It was a sanctuary. The man behind the counter, weathered and sturdy, with a kind face and eyes that had seen too much, looked up as I entered. He was the owner, a man everyone called Pops Henderson. His gaze fell on the small, discreet Air Force insignia on my bag. He didn't say a word. He simply nodded once, a gesture of silent understanding. I ordered a black coffee, and as I waited, he placed a plate on the counter in front of me. On it was a generous slice of homemade apple pie, still warm from the oven, the cinnamon-laced steam rising in the quiet air. I looked at him, confused. "My mother used to make that for me every time I came home from Quezon," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "She said it could fix just about anything." I sat at the counter and took a bite. The crust was flaky, the apples tender, the warmth spreading through me. chasing away a fraction of the bone-deep chill that had taken root days ago. It wasn't a cure, but it was a comfort, a moment of peace offered without questions, without judgment. It was an unspoken kindness from an old Marine who knew the look of someone who had just walked through hell and back. Because, as he'd said, everyone in this place had. In that quiet moment, I felt a sense of belonging that my own family's lavish parties could never provide. My phone buzzed, pulling me from my reverie. It was Serafina. "We've got our first hit," she said, her voice sharp with triumph. My digital forensics guy, Orion Vex, was digging through the source code of the original Meridian contract. He found a ghost file embedded in the metadata. I held my breath. "It was a scan of a fake state ID for you, Taryn, a driver's license. But that's not the best part. The metadata on the image file itself was a treasure trove. It contained a digital footprint that couldn't be scrubbed. An IP address. I could hear her smile through the phone. We traced it. It leads directly to a secure server located at your father's private estate in Los Altos Hills. A direct link, irrefutable proof, the first real weapon in our arsenal, the foundation for the war to come." Serafina's voice dropped, becoming serious. "We've got him, Colonel. The first nail is in his coffin. The question is, are you ready to pull the trigger?" The day after Serafina's call, I met her digital forensics expert, Orion Vex. He wasn't the stereotypical nerdy hacker I might have expected. Orion was a former Marine Corps SIGINT officer, broad-shouldered and steady, with a prosthetic limb that he handled with casual indifference. He'd lost part of his leg in Fallujah. When our eyes met, I saw what I had seen in Serafina's gaze. No pity, only recognition. We were veterans of different wars, but we understood the cost. We sat in a small, secure conference room, and he walked me through his findings. He didn't dumb it down. He spoke to me in the language we both understood, a dialect of discipline and shared hardship. "Colonel," he began, pulling up lines of code on a large monitor. "In our world, a digital footprint is like a boot print in the desert. It tells a story. Your father didn't just leave a footprint, he left a 6-lane highway." He showed me the embedded files, the hidden data, the way the IP address was routed. It was a masterclass in digital tracking. The trust between us was immediate, forged in shared terminology and mutual respect. For the first time in this whole ordeal, I felt like I wasn't just a victim. I was part of an operational team. I had found my tribe. Later that afternoon, seeking the quiet comfort I'd discovered the day before, I returned to the LZ. Pops Henderson gave me his familiar silent nod and poured a black coffee without my having to ask. I sat at the bar, sharing a quiet story with him about a sandstorm in Iraq, when the chime above the door sounded. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. My mother, Genevieve Vance, swept in. She entered like a foreign species, her Chanel suit a pristine armor against the authenticity of the room. She was a queen invading a foxhole. The warm, comforting scent of coffee and old wood seemed to recoil from her expensive French perfume. She wrinkled her nose, her eyes scanning the humble space with undisguised contempt. "Taryn," she said, her voice dripping with a carefully curated blend of disbelief and disappointment. "I cannot believe I found you in a place like this." The way she said "this" made it sound like a disease. Her gaze swept over Pops, then to the few other quiet veterans sitting at small tables, and she dismissed them all as broken relics. She had obviously hired a private investigator to find me. The thought sent a chill down my spine. She glided to the bar, her heels clicking ominously on the wooden floor. "I came to talk sense into you," she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You are destroying this family over some childish fantasy, some jealous delusion. Your father was only trying to protect your assets while you were away." The lie was so bald-faced, so audacious, that it stole my breath. She was trying to gaslight me in front of the only people who had shown me genuine kindness, attempting to isolate me by painting me as unstable. She was trying to poison my sanctuary, but something inside me, a steel girder forged in years of command, refused to bend. The warmth that Pops's apple pie had kindled in me didn't vanish, it hardened, it became fuel. I slowly swiveled on my bar stool to face her. I stood up, not as a daughter, but as a commanding officer. The relaxed posture I'd enjoyed just moments before vanished, replaced by the ramrod straight spine of Colonel Taryn Wells. The warmth in my eyes cooled to an Arctic frost. "This is a place for heroes, ma'am," I said. My voice was low, perfectly steady, but each word was a sliver of ice. I put a deliberate, cold emphasis on ma'am, a term of formal respect that I now used to build a wall between us, a concept you will never understand. I took a step toward her, claiming the space. "You have invaded my private space. You are not welcome here. Leave, now." Genevieve was stunned into silence. She had expected tears, arguments, a daughter's emotional collapse. She had not expected a direct order from a superior officer. Her perfectly made-up face contorted with a flash of rage and frustration. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, defeated by the absolute certainty in my voice. With a final venomous glare, she turned and stormed out, her angry clicks echoing in the sudden silence. The door swung shut behind her, and the quiet, respectful peace of the LZ slowly returned. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. A large, warm hand came to rest on my shoulder. It was Pop's. He squeezed gently. "You did the right thing, son," he said, using the old-timer term of endearment. I wonder if any of you have ever had a moment like that. A moment where you had to choose between the family you were born into and the family that truly sees you. For me, that was the moment. I knew then that I wasn't just fighting for my own honor anymore. I was fighting to protect this place, these people, this small patch of hallowed ground. Some battles had to be fought right where you stood. After my mother's failed assault at the LZ, a different strategy was deployed. The frontal attack had failed, so the enemy resorted to psychological warfare. A few days later, a sleek black courier service delivered a thick, cream-colored envelope to my temporary apartment. It was from my father. Inside, on heavy, expensive stationery, was a handwritten letter. His script was elegant, controlled just like him. The words were a carefully constructed barrage of sentimentality. He wrote of his father's love, of the difficult business decisions he was forced to make in a volatile market. He never once admitted fault. Instead, he painted himself as a victim of circumstance, a patriarch protecting the future of his two daughters. It wasn't an apology. It was a prelude to a demand, a performance. The final paragraph invited me to a private dinner, a chance to talk things through as a family. I saw the manipulation for what it was. Seraphina's warning echoed in my head. He won't attack you with force. He'll attack you with memory. And yet a small, treacherous part of me, the part that was still a 7-year-old girl, entertained a flicker of hope. A stupid, stubborn hope that this time it might be different. I agreed to meet him. He chose the French Laundry in Yountville, an icon of Californian opulence. The restaurant was quiet, reverent, a temple of haute cuisine. It was a power play, a reminder of the world he inhabited. We were seated at a secluded table. Alistair began the evening playing the part of the remorseful father. He ordered an expensive bottle of wine and spoke softly, his voice full of a practiced, theatrical sorrow. He leaned forward, a wistful smile on his face. "Do you remember," he began, "when you were about 7, you fell off your bicycle? Scraped your knee up pretty bad? You were trying so hard not to cry." He paused, letting the memory hang in the air between us. "I carried you all the way home. You were so small then." He was weaponizing my childhood, using a genuine moment of tenderness as a tool to disarm me. The colonel in me recognized the tactic, but the daughter in me felt a pang of loss for the man I once thought he was. He let the silence linger, then his tone shifted, becoming more businesslike. The performance was over. "Taryn," he said, his voice now crisp and direct, "I just need you to sign a document." He slid a leather-bound folder across the pristine white tablecloth. It stopped just short of my wineglass. "It's a simple affidavit," he explained, his eyes boring into mine. "It just confirms that I was acting with your verbal consent as your proxy. It will make all of this misunderstanding, go away. We can go back to how things were." I stared at the folder. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for my complicity. He was asking me to take my own honor, the very core of my identity, and publicly burn it on the altar of his reputation. He wanted me to validate his crimes, to become a co-conspirator in my own violation. Also, things could go back to how they were. The last foolish flicker of hope inside me died, turning to ash. I looked up from the folder and met his gaze. My own eyes felt like chips of ice. "Back to how things were?" I asked. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the restaurant's hushed atmosphere like a razor. "You mean back to when you made me your unwitting accomplice? Back to when my name was used to cripple a fellow officer?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The cold, hard truth was louder than any shout. I placed my hand on the leather folder and slowly, deliberately, pushed it back across the table toward him. "I won't sign it." Alistair's face, which had been a mask of paternal concern, began to crumble. "Taryn, don't be foolish." "And do you know why I won't sign it?" I continued, my voice unwavering. I leaned forward slightly. "Because a soldier never, ever leaves the truth behind on the battlefield." I stood up, my chair making no sound on the plush carpet. I placed my napkin neatly on the table, a final formal gesture of dismissal. I left him there, a king sitting alone amidst the ruins of his feast, surrounded by expensive food he would now eat in a dead, suffocating silence. The last drop had fallen, the dam had broken. As I walked out of that temple of lies and into the cool Napa Valley night, I knew with absolute certainty that every bridge back to my old life had just been burned to the ground, and I was the one holding the match. I drove away from the French Laundry with no destination in mind, my hands gripping the steering wheel in a white-knuckled clamp. The polished conversation, the clinking of silverware, the absolute soul-crushing audacity of my father's request, it all swirled into a toxic storm inside me. The sky over the San Francisco Bay Area seemed to agree. A ferocious winter storm had rolled in off the Pacific, and the rain began to fall in blinding, angry sheets. I found myself at a scenic overlook on the Marin Headlands, the one that gives you a postcard view of the Golden Gate Bridge. Tonight, there was no postcard. The iconic red-orange structure was a ghostly silhouette against a black, churning sky, battling the wind and the waves crashing violently against the rocks below. The storm outside was a perfect roaring mirror for the one raging within my soul. And finally, after a lifetime of disciplined suppression, it broke. The anger, the grief, the profound frustration of nearly 20 years of being diminished, of being treated as an inconvenient afterthought, of my sacrifices being weighed on a financial scale and found wanting, it all came roaring to the surface. I slammed my fist against the unyielding plastic of the steering wheel again and again. The dull thud a desperate counterpoint to the drumming rain. A raw, ragged scream tore from my throat, a sound I didn't recognize as my own. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of a soldier finally reaching her absolute breaking point, under a weight no training could prepare you for. But I didn't cry. Tears were a luxury, a form of surrender I couldn't afford. Rage, however, was fuel, and my tank was finally full. In the echoing silence after my scream, something shifted. The chaotic storm of emotion began to coalesce. The rage didn't disappear, it crystallized, it focused, becoming a single, hard, brilliant point of light, as clear and sharp as a targeting laser in the dead of night. My mission was no longer about defense or survival. It was about righteous retribution. A quote my first training instructor at the Air Force Academy, a grizzled old master sergeant, used to drill into us. A quote from Theodore Roosevelt echoed in my mind. It is not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. My father, my mother, they were the critics. They sat in their clean, comfortable, climate-controlled seats and passed judgment. But I was the one in the arena. My face was marred by the dust of Afghanistan and the sweat of command. I had dared greatly, and they had used that daring as a cover for their crimes. It was time I started fighting like it. I put the car in drive, the tires squealing on the wet pavement as I turned around with a ferocity that surprised me. I drove with a new, chilling purpose, straight back to my small temporary apartment. I didn't hesitate. I walked to my laptop, flipped it open, and began to type. The document I was drafting was the most important of my career, more critical than any after-action report or strategic plan. It was my formal request for early, honorable retirement from the United States Air Force. This wasn't a surrender, it was a strategic redeployment. I was shedding my uniform, not out of disrespect, but out of absolute necessity. In that uniform, I was bound by military law, by a rigid chain of command, by rules of engagement that did not apply to this new domestic enemy. As a civilian, I would be free to fight this war on my own terms, free to hire the most ruthless lawyers, to speak to the press, to use the weapons of the world my father understood so well. I was unchaining myself so that I could, in turn, destroy his empire. My finger hovered over the mouse for only a second. Then I clicked, send. The email vanished into the ether. A sense of profound, terrifying liberation washed over me. The die was cast. There was no turning back. I immediately picked up my phone. I checked the time. It was just after 11 p.m. here on the West Coast, which meant it was just after 2 a.m. in D.C. I didn't care. A war doesn't keep business hours. I dialed Serafina Croft's direct line. She answered on the second ring, her voice instantly alert and clear, not the least bit groggy. "Serafina," I said. My voice was different now. The last traces of doubt of the hopeful daughter were gone, burned away in the storm. All that remained was the cold, hard certainty of a colonel with a clear and final objective. "It's Taryn Wells." "I know," she said, her voice calm. "I've submitted my retirement papers," I stated, no emotion in my voice. "It's done. I want you to prepare everything. We're bringing this all into the light. No compromises, no negotiations. Launch the campaign." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a beat of charged silence, and in it I could almost hear her smile. It was the sound of a predator sensing the hunt was about to begin. "Roger that, Colonel," she replied, her voice alight with a fierce, joyful energy. "Welcome to the civilian front." My call to Serafina was a declaration of war. The next morning, her office transformed. It was no longer a minimalist, high-powered law firm. It was a war room, a tactical operations center. A massive whiteboard dominated one wall, covered in a complex web of Alistair's companies, shell corporations, and holding firms. Red arrows, drawn with aggressive slashes, mapped the illegal flow of money from Department of Defense contracts to his personal venture fund. Serafina, Kale, Orion, and I operated like a special missions unit, each with a specific role. Serafina was the commander, directing the legal assault. Orion was our G2, our intelligence chief, digging through terabytes of data. Kyle was my executive officer, coordinating logistics and providing a steady, reliable presence. And I was the subject matter expert. I was the one who knew the terrain and the players. "The paper trail is crucial," I said, pointing to a name on the board. "A key executive in an aerospace firm. But it's not enough. We need human intelligence. We need people who can testify that Alistair Vance knows nothing about aerospace engineering, that he's a financial predator, a brilliant opportunist who saw the defense industry as his personal ATM. We need to dismantle not just his actions, but his entire manufactured persona." We worked relentlessly, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of purpose. But a predator, when cornered, doesn't simply surrender. It bites back. The first counterattack came via a phone call. The caller ID showed a retired 4-star general, a man I deeply respected, a legend in the Air Force. He was friendly, avuncular. He talked about the good old days before getting to the point. "Taryn," he said, his voice laced with false concern. "I've known Alistair for years. He's a patriot. I think you should reconsider this path for the good of everyone involved." He was calling in a favor for my father. Alistair was using his powerful network to isolate me, to turn my own world against me. I politely but firmly ended the call, the betrayal leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. The second counterattack was more direct. Kale, with his trained eye for surveillance, spotted them first. A man in a nondescript sedan parked across the street from my apartment. Another one reading a newspaper at a coffee shop Kyle and I frequented. We were being followed. Kyle was tense. "I can lose them," he said, his protective instincts on high alert. "No," I replied, a cold, strategic thought forming in my mind. "Don't lose them. We're going to use them." My father was playing chess, moving his powerful pieces across the board. It was time I showed him I could play too. That evening, I had Kale drive me to a popular diner in downtown San Jose. It was loud, crowded, and most importantly, located 2 blocks from the West Coast headquarters of Wired, one of the most influential tech publications in the world. We took a booth by the window in plain sight. We didn't discuss the case. We talked about old missions, laughed, and I made sure to occasionally gesture with a file folder I was carrying. I knew our tale would report every detail. Target met with associate. Location is near major media outlet. She appears confident, unconcerned. It was a simple psychological operation, a psyop, designed to inject a single, powerful thought into my father's mind. She's going to the press. Let him sweat. Let him wonder what I knew and when I would leak it. For days, the war was a stalemate of legal maneuvers and shadowy threats. Serafina's team filed subpoenas, and Alistair's lawyers filed motions to quash them. But Orion Vex, our silent warrior, was digging. He was sifting through mountains of data they had legally acquired from a server dump mandated by one of Serafina's early court orders. The breakthrough came late one night. I was in the war room with Serafina, both of us exhausted, when Orion walked in. He looked different. The usual stoic calm on his face was replaced by something else, a look of profound, shocked discovery. "I found it," he said quietly. "The motive, the smoking gun." It wasn't a hidden contract or a secret bank account. It was something far more personal, far more damning. He projected a string of emails onto the whiteboard. They were between Alistair and his personal estate lawyer, dated from the very beginning of the fraud. In the emails, Alistair was discussing the creation of a massive, irrevocable trust fund. He outlined the funding source with chilling clarity. The initial profit skimmed from the very first set of fraudulent defense contracts, the contracts signed with my stolen name. Serafina read the document aloud, her voice filled with disbelief. "This trust, named the Alara Vance Future Fund, is to be the sole beneficiary of these initial investment returns." She stopped, looking at me with wide, astonished eyes. The money he had stolen in my name, the money meant to secure my uncertain future, was never intended for me. It was all for Alara. "He used the money he stole in your name to build a legacy for your sister," Serafina breathed, the full monstrous weight of it settling in the room. "Alara was the reason for it all. She's the entire motive." We all stared at the screen, at the undeniable proof. My sister, the golden child, was the sun around which this entire criminal enterprise orbited. And the most sickening part? She probably had no idea. She was just another tool in his grand design, the beloved justification for his ugliest sins. This changed everything. We didn't just have a legal case anymore. We had the heart of the story. We had his weakness. The hearing room of the Federal Civilian Review Board was designed to intimidate. It was a grand wood-paneled space, dominated by a massive horseshoe-shaped table, where the board members sat like robed judges. It wasn't a courtroom, it was an arena. And I was ready for battle. I sat beside Serafina, my back straight, my hands resting calmly in my lap. Across the room, my father, Alistair Vance, was flanked by a team of expensive, confident lawyers. I focused on my breathing, a steady rhythm I'd perfected under fire. In, out. I didn't see a father. I saw a high-value target whose defenses were about to be systematically dismantled. Alistair's lead counsel began, and as expected, they painted a masterpiece of deception. They portrayed Alistair as a wounded, loving father, forced to step in to manage the finances of his emotionally volatile and distracted daughter. They produced my own emails from the field, cherry-picked and edited to make my exhaustion sound like instability, my dedication sound like obsession. Then Alistair himself took the stand. He delivered a performance worthy of an Oscar, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "I only did what any father would do," he said, his eyes pleading with the board. "I was trying to protect her legacy." It was a brilliant performance. I could see a few of the board members shifting in their seats, their expressions softening with sympathy. Through it all, I remained perfectly still, my face a mask of neutrality. I was a calm lake before a hurricane. Then it was our turn. Serafina Croft rose, her red hair a slash of color in the somber room. She moved with the fluid grace of a predator. She didn't attack Alistair directly. She started with the foundation. "Let's talk about signatures," she said brightly. Orion's forensic analysis flashed onto the large screen behind the board. The algorithmic perfection of the forged signatures was laid bare, the absence of human imperfection glaringly obvious. One by one, Serafina dismantled the paper trail of lies. Then came the audio file. "This is a recorded call between Mr. Vance and a business associate," Serafina announced. Alistair's confident, booming laugh filled the chamber. "Taryn?" his recorded voice said, dripping with condescension. "She'll never know. She's too busy playing hero in some godforsaken desert to pay attention to the details. That's what I count on." A collective gasp went through the room. Alistair's face paled slightly, the first crack in his perfect facade. "The defense claims Mr. Vance was a concerned father," Serafina continued, her voice dripping with acid. "This recording suggests he was a calculating opportunist who viewed his daughter's service as a convenient cover for his crimes. The final blow, however, needed to be delivered by me." "The petitioner calls Colonel Taryn Wells to the stand," Serafina said. I walked to the witness chair, my steps even and measured. I sat, was sworn in, and turned to face the board. I could feel my father's eyes on me, burning with a new, panicked hatred. I refused to look at him. Serafina asked me only one question. "Colonel, please tell the board, in your own words, what has happened." I took a breath. I didn't recount the pain, the lies, the betrayals. That was the story of a victim. I was here as a soldier. I looked directly at the chairman of the board, my voice clear and strong, echoing in the silent room. "You may be my father," I said, finally turning my head to lock eyes with Alistair, "but that does not give you the right to write my life." The statement, simple and absolute, hung in the air. It wasn't an accusation, it was a declaration of independence. Serafina let the words settle, then turned back to the board. "One final piece of evidence," she said, her voice dropping for dramatic effect. "The why, the motive behind it all." She clicked a button. A new document filled the large screen. The title was clear for all to see. The Alara Vance Future Fund. Trust Agreement. "This, members of the board, is a trust fund established by Mr. Vance," Serafina explained. "It was capitalized with the profits from the very first fraudulent contracts, the ones bearing the Colonel's forged signature. The money stolen in Taryn Wells' name was used to build a fortune, not for her, but for her sister." Every eye in the room, including mine, swiveled to the front row where my family sat. My mother looked horrified. And Alara, my golden child sister, stared at the screen, her face ashen. Her eyes darted from her own name in the title of the trust to the funding sources, and then finally to our father. The realization dawned on her face, a slow, agonizing wave of horror. Her entire life, her celebrated genius, her bright future. It was all financed by a crime against her own sister. She turned to Alistair, her voice a choked, broken whisper that was somehow audible in the stunned silence. "You used me too." That was it. That was the moment the world shattered. Not my accusation, not Serafina's evidence, but the heartbroken words of his favored child. The final wall of Alistair's elaborate deception crumbled into dust. He stared at Alara, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. His defense, his justification, his entire moral posture, all of it gone. He visibly deflated, shrinking in his expensive suit. He slumped back into his chair, a puppet with its strings cut. His face, once so smug and powerful, was now a ghastly shade of gray. The game was over. The aftermath of the hearing was swift and brutal. The Department of Justice, armed with the board's findings, announced formal criminal charges against Alistair Vance. His assets were frozen. His tech empire, built on a foundation of lies, began to crumble under the weight of public scandal and federal investigation. The news was everywhere. I should have felt triumphant, vindicated, but I felt none of those things. The silence after the storm was louder than the battle itself. There was no elation, only a vast, hollow exhaustion that settled deep in my bones. My phone rang incessantly. Kyle, Serafina, reporters. But I let it go to voicemail. I sat in the sterile silence of my temporary apartment, staring out the window at a city that didn't care, and felt the immense gravity of what had just happened. The war was won, but the price of victory was a family irrevocably shattered. And I was the one who had dropped the bomb. A few days later, there was a soft knock on my door. It was Alara. The arrogance and entitlement that had always clung to her like expensive perfume were gone. In their place was a raw, fragile brokenness. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. "I'm sorry, Taryn," she whispered, her voice cracking. Tears welled up and streamed down her face. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I swear I never knew." My first instinct, the old, ingrained instinct of an older sister, was to pull her into a hug, to comfort her. But I held myself back. To do so would be to lie, to pretend that we could go back to what we were, and I was done with lies. I looked at her, my gaze steady, not unkind, but unflinching. "You know now, Alara," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "So what you do with that knowledge is what matters. Go live a life that makes my sacrifice worthwhile. Build your own legacy, a clean one." It wasn't forgiveness. I didn't have that to give. It was a release. I was releasing her from my story and handing her the responsibility for her own. She looked at me, a flicker of understanding in her tear-filled eyes, then nodded slowly and walked away. I closed the door, feeling the profound, painful finality of that last goodbye. Later that week, a package arrived. It was a large cardboard box with my mother's neat, elegant handwriting on the shipping label. I opened it. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was my childhood. Old, worn stuffed animals, a box of swimming medals from high school, and on top of it all, a framed photograph. It was me at maybe 6 years old, beaming with a gap-toothed smile, sitting on my father's shoulders. We were both incandescently happy. It was a final desperate attempt at emotional warfare, a package of weaponized nostalgia sent from a mother I no longer knew. And it worked, just not in the way she intended. Looking at that photo, at that little girl's innocent, trusting face, the dam I had so carefully constructed inside me finally broke. For the first time through this entire ordeal, I cried. I wept for that little girl who believed her father was a hero. I wept for the loss of an innocence I never even knew I'd had. I grieved for a family that had never really existed. When the tears finally subsided, a strange calm settled over me. The Serenity Prayer, a piece of wisdom Pops Henderson had framed behind his counter, came to my mind. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I couldn't change who my parents were. I couldn't change the past, but I could change what I did next. With a newfound sense of purpose, I began to pack everything back into the box. I handled each item with a strange reverence: the worn-out teddy bear, the tarnished medals, the photograph of a ghost. I closed the flaps and sealed the box with tape. My first thought was to burn it, to obliterate the past in a fit of rage. But burning is an act of anger, of passion. I didn't feel that anymore. I felt a quiet need for peace. So instead, I carried the box down to my car and drove to a local Goodwill donation center. I placed it on the loading dock next to other people's discarded histories. It wasn't an act of erasure, it was an act of release. I wasn't destroying my past, I was simply choosing to leave it behind, to let it become a part of someone else's story. As I drove away, I didn't look back. I was finally letting go of the weight, freeing myself not just from them, but from the person I had been in their shadow. The war was over, the dead were buried, and for the first time, the future felt like an open sky. 1 year later, I stood on the stage of the Arnold Hall Auditorium at the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, the place where my journey began. The air was crisp, the mountains a majestic backdrop outside the vast windows. I was back in my dress blues, the uniform crisp and familiar. I had been invited back as a guest lecturer for their course on leadership in crisis. Before me sat hundreds of young cadets, their faces a mixture of discipline, ambition, and youthful idealism. I looked out at them, and in the front row I saw my real family. Cale sat tall and proud, his steady gaze meeting mine. Beside him, Seraphina Croft, the corporate destroyer, looked fiercely protective. Next to her was Orion Vex, the digital warrior who had found the truth. And at the end of the row, beaming, was Pops Henderson, who had flown all the way from D.C. to be here. They weren't just applauding. Their eyes shone with a profound, unconditional pride that warmed me from the inside out. I didn't tell the cadets the sordid details of my story. I didn't need to. I spoke to them about the nature of truth, the weight of loyalty, and the difficult, often lonely choices that define a leader. Honor is not a noun, I told them, my voice resonating in the quiet hall. It's not a medal you can pin on your chest or a title you can write before your name. Honor is a verb. It's what you do every single day, in the choices you make, big and small, especially when no one is watching. I spoke of the different kinds of battlefields, not just the ones of sand and rock, but the ones in boardrooms, in courtrooms, and in the quiet, desperate chambers of the human heart. I told them that the most dangerous enemy is not always the one you can see, but the one who whispers that your principles are for sale. When I finished, the applause was thunderous, but it was what happened afterward that truly mattered. As I was leaving the stage, a young woman, a first-year cadet with bright, determined eyes, approached me. "Colonel Wells," she said, her voice filled with a powerful sincerity. "Your story, what I've read about it, it reminded me why I'm here, why this uniform matters. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for not staying silent." In that moment, looking into her earnest face, I finally understood my legacy. It wasn't the millions in a stolen fund, or the headlines in the news, or even the medals I had earned. My legacy was this spark I had just helped ignite in the heart of the next generation. It was the sudden, breathtaking realization that I had managed to transform my deepest pain into a lesson in resilience for others. My story was no longer just mine. It belonged to her now, and to all the others who would choose to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. The final scene of my story didn't take place in a hearing room or an office. There were no more enemies to fight, no more lies to unravel. It took place in the sky. Kyle and I were in a small 2-seater training plane, a Diamond DA-40 soaring over the vast blue expanse above Colorado. He was at the controls, but this flight was for me. The wind whipped through the open cockpit, carrying the scent of pine from the Rockies below. I was no longer a ghost at a party, no longer a victim of a cruel deception. I was a pilot, a teacher, a survivor. I looked out at the endless horizon, at the world painted in shades of blue and gold. Down there on the ground were the messy, complicated battles of men. But up here there was only peace, clarity, freedom. A genuine smile, the first truly effortless smile I'd had in years, spread across my face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy, of peace earned and a future reclaimed. They had tried to steal my legacy. They had tried to define me by their greed and write my life with their lies. They thought a legacy was something written on paper, a number in a bank account. But they were wrong. They had never understood where to find the real me. They had never thought to look up. My true legacy was never on the ground. It was written here, in the contrails of jets, in the silent language of flight, across the vast open sky. That day, flying over the Rockies, I finally understood. My story wasn't about the family I lost, but the one I found, in the integrity of my friends and in the resilient spirit of people like you, who listen and understand. So many of us have our own quiet battles, our own stories that need to be told. If my journey has echoed a part of yours, please share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in the power of overcoming, subscribe to Chosen Revenge for more stories that remind us we are never truly alone.